Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Let's start our video with a story about a workplace where showing up early used to mean working late for free. But one employee decided to flip the system in the most satisfying way possible. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with the turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. How I turned unpaid overtime into paid downtime. My job is 12-hour shifts with a flexible start time. You must show up before 7, but you can work as early as 6 if you want, and most people opt to show up before 6:30. The last person's usually in before 6:45. We let people go home at the end of the shift on a first-in, first-out basis. In theory, you should be able to go home after you've worked your 12 hours, but in practice, there's usually a disparity of arrival times between the outgoing shift and the oncoming shift. For example, I may have started at 6:15 as the fourth person in, and I'm relieved by the fourth person in on the next shift, but that person might show up at 6:45, making me stay 30 minutes late. I can't complain to that person because it's their right to show up at 6:45. I talked to my supervisor about this because it had been happening pretty frequently. She said the company won't pay me for the extra time because, according to her, it's my choice to arrive earlier than 7, and that's just the risk I take in being early. She also said she's not willing to move any people around to cover my role to get me out on time, even though they regularly do that to let people take unscheduled bathroom breaks and do training. She said it'd be different if I wasn't relieved by 7 because someone is really late, but before 7 they don't care. Solution? I show up at 6:59 now. I'm always the last one in. I leave later than everyone, but I'm also guaranteed never to work a single extra unpaid minute. It also means that the person I relieve is having to stay late because, again, the last person usually shows up before 6:45. It also means I usually get relieved earlier than 12 hours. I still have to stay in the building until I reach 12 hours, tracked with badge cards, but ultimately they're still paying me for 10 to 15 minutes of wandering the hallways or reading a book. So basically they went from regularly stiffing me 15 to 30 minutes of pay to regularly having to pay me to do 15 to 30 minutes of nothing. Edit. About the unscheduled bathroom breaks, probably sounds worse than it is. So we get 15-minute breaks every 90 minutes, and generally, if you have to use the bathroom, that's when you go. You have about 8 opportunities throughout the shift to do it. And then on top of that, you can still go between breaks if you really need it. That's what I mean by unscheduled. We get paid on these breaks. It doesn't deduct from the 12-hour time card. If the company won't recognize your extra effort or compensate you for the time you're forced to stay late, why should you inconvenience yourself to be early? By coming in at the last minute, you're not breaking any rules. You're just working within the same boundaries they've set for you. It's ironic that their unwillingness to address the issue has resulted in them effectively paying you to chill for 10 to 15 minutes every shift. And our second story. Landlord's tantrum backfires, leaving him in deep trouble. I live in a very tenant-friendly area. We have rent control, and landlords are not allowed to do things like demand security deposits, enter the property without proper written notice, or include no pet clauses in leases, which renew automatically every month after a fixed term ends. For the last 11 years, my husband and I have had a great relationship with our landlord, Joe, fake name. We've been very lenient in regards to repairs, and Joe was very forgiving when my husband and I both lost our jobs at the same time in 2016 and fell a few months behind on rent. We're now ahead on rent, but Joe's still very behind in maintenance and repairs. We have a whole laundry list of issues my landlord's aware of, but hasn't done anything about for years, but we didn't care because he left us alone and has been overall very kind to us. A few years ago, our landlord allowed us to start storing stuff in an old rundown shed behind our rented portion of the yard. We never stored anything valuable out there because it's falling apart, and squirrels have been using it to cache walnuts from the numerous walnut trees in our yard. We had an old barbecue, lawnmower, ladders, and outside toys for my kids in there. Until recently. A few months ago, Joe shows up asking about the shed, wanting to know what we had stored out there, I told him just some old junk we'll probably throw out soon. He told us that the family next door has a mouse problem, we don't, and he wants us to clear out the shed to prevent issues, and because I want it to look nice around here. I said, okay, I'll talk to my husband and we'll get it cleared out whenever we get a chance. I have an infant at home, so I can't go out back and clean it out myself unless someone else is here to watch the baby. My husband had scheduled surgery, so he wasn't able to do any heavy lifting until after he recovered. Admittedly, cleaning out the old shed was not a high priority. Then Joe sent me a passive-aggressive text. I just wanted to remind you that tomorrow's garbage day. We know garbage pickup's always been on Monday, and we need to work together to keep the rental property nice for everyone to enjoy. I replied asking him if he had plans to fix the shed, to remove his scrap pickup truck, or to remove his open compost piles and heaps of mixed concrete and scrap metal he has out by the shed he wants us to clean. I also explained that my husband just had surgery and that we weren't planning on cleaning the shed that day. Read it? He did not like that. He showed up unannounced, walked inside, and proceeded to yell at us in front of our kids. He complained about his personal finances and the economy, inflation, property taxes, swore at us about our effing crap, and told us we can't use the shed anymore and threatened to evict us because clearly you don't like living here, and I can get way more for this house than what you're paying now. We told him to leave, and that we will not communicate with him anymore unless in writing. He said, fine, we'll do it all by the book from now on, and stormed out. The next day, he put an eviction notice on our mailbox complaining that we have excessive garbage and waste in outbuildings, that we refuse to discuss this issue and corrective action with the landlord, and even adding that he felt it was unreasonable given the fact that he didn't evict us for late rent back in 2016. The note gives us 7 days to correct the issues or else my landlord can file for an eviction hearing. The next day, while I cleaned out everything belonging to us, sans the walnuts and squirrel poop from the shed, my husband got busy contacting local bylaw and the Rental Housing Enforcement Agency, traffic cops for landlords. He was given information on how to file against the landlord for refusing to do repairs, illegal entry, loss of an amenity, the shed, and harassment. After a surprise inspection that happened last week, we were given a report that said Joe was given 90 days to fix the roof, plumbing, and weeping tile. He must demolish the shed and either erect a new shed or give us a rent reduction because the shed was an assumed amenity. According to my neighbors with the mice issue, the provincial government is also involved now because apparently he filled in a pond without a permit, and now the fire department doesn't have a nearby water source in case of a fire. No hydrants out here. The city, by law enforcement, threatened to fine him for every day that he leaves his large pile of broken concrete and rebar out back. The cherry on top happened yesterday. He sent me a text to tell me that him and the plumber were going to be there within the hour. Normally, I'd be okay with short notice, despite the law saying he must provide 24-hour written notice. Not this time. I told him we'd need 24-hour notice. He showed up, knocked on the door, and when I reminded him that I won't speak to him in person anymore, he called the police saying I was being hostile towards him and he doesn't feel safe coming here. He sat outside for 4 hours waiting for the police, who later called me instead of showing up. The officer who called said that Joe was told to stop harassing us and that he needs to provide 24 hours notice to enter the home. He wanted to make sure Joe left and gave proper notice and asked me if I wanted an officer there tomorrow to keep the peace. If Joe doesn't do the repairs he's supposed to, we plan to take him to court and file for a rent reduction and for a lien to be put on the property so he can't just sell it. We're just doing it by the book from now on and just want it to look nice. Your landlord dug his own grave here. You and your husband were patient, accommodating tenants for years, even tolerating major neglect on his part. But the moment Joe tried to bully you over the shed, he unleashed a chain of events he couldn't control. From illegal eviction threats to showing up unannounced, he underestimated your resolve and the tenant-friendly laws protecting you. By documenting everything and involving authorities, you turned the tables perfectly. His entitled attitude backfired spectacularly, proving that treating tenants fairly would have been far less costly. Well played. And our last story. HOA Karen shouldn't have showered in chemicals. I live in a quiet suburb in a small U.S. town. I won't mention the name here, and I take pride in the fact that my private property remains just that, private. My house sits comfortably behind a tall wooden fence that makes it clear no trespassing, but if anyone ever ignores boundaries, it's my neighbor, Betty Lou. I'd call her HOA Karen, but that would be too cliche. The locals nicknamed her Betty Sees All. She's a master at sticking her nose where it doesn't belong, with a sharp tongue and a talent for stirring up trouble. It all began one sunny Saturday when I decided to indulge in my hobby, conducting science experiments in my backyard. As a DIY enthusiast, I had this idea to create a glowing pond that would light up my garden at night. Using a combination of non-toxic luminescent chemicals, I mixed up a batch of glowing liquid in large barrels hidden in my backyard. Just in case, I slapped bright yellow warning labels on each container. Caution, do not touch. Setting everything up took almost the entire day. Satisfied with the result, I left the barrels covered so the chemical reaction could complete overnight. My dog Max, a lazy golden retriever, lounged nearby, paying no attention to the commotion. Feeling secure, I called it a night. The next morning, I stepped into the yard with a mug of coffee to check on my experiment. To my surprise, the lid of one of the barrels was slightly ajar. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, but then I noticed muddy footprints leading from the barrel to the fence that separated my yard from Betty's. As I puzzled over this, I heard Betty's familiar shrill scream from the neighboring yard. "What the heck? What did you do to me?" She yelled so loudly that the local birds scattered in every direction. Curious and slightly alarmed, I approached the fence. That's when I saw her. In her yard, wearing a bright pink robe and fluffy slippers, stood Betty Lou, but she wasn't her usual self. Her skin was a deep, vivid blue, somewhere between cobalt and navy. Even her hands and neck were stained this brilliant color. She looked like a character from Avatar who'd spent 50 years living in an HOA. "Betty," I began cautiously, struggling to keep a straight face. "What happened to you?" "What happened to me? What happened to me?" she shrieked, waving a blue-stained hand in my direction. "I'll tell you what happened. I was minding my own business when I saw you fiddling around in your yard yesterday. I thought you were up to something suspicious, so I climbed over your fence to check it out." I raised an eyebrow. "You climbed over my fence? Into my yard?" "Don't change the subject," she snapped. "I saw those barrels and thought you were hiding something dangerous. When I leaned over to open one of them, I slipped." She hesitated, looking momentarily embarrassed before returning to her rage. "And now look at me." I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. "Betty, that's luminescent dye. It's completely harmless, but it's semi-permanent. You're going to be blue for at least a couple of weeks." Her face, or what I could see of it beneath the blue, turned red. "You did this on purpose. You wanted to humiliate me." "Betty," I said, still laughing, "you trespassed onto my property, ignored the warning signs, and dunked yourself in a barrel of chemicals. This is entirely your fault. And if the cops show up, you'd better hope they don't arrest you instead of me," I added with a smirk. Betty clammed up and stormed back into her house. Word of the incident spread quickly around the neighborhood. By Monday, everyone was calling her Blue Betty. Kids whispered about her like she was some kind of mythical creature. For weeks, Betty refused to leave her house, venturing outside only under cover of darkness. I heard she even lost her job as a secretary because of it. The dye eventually faded, but the nickname stuck. Now, whenever someone new moves into the neighborhood, I tell them the story of Blue Betty as a cautionary tale. Such an important lesson Karen could only learn through her own experience. And she was very lucky that the guy wasn't into sulfuric acid as a hobby instead of blue temporary dye. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.